Shalom. Welcome to Light to the Nations. We're ready to begin our study of the laws pertaining to the Holy Temple. And this is the classic work of Maimonides, who is known as the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And this work deals with all of the aspects of the commandment of the temple. And as we shall see, this is a commandment that includes many specifics, many subdivisions. It's organized in a very lucid fashion. Maimonides is known for his clarity and lucidity. And we're going to explore together some of the major concepts pertaining to the Holy Temple as it applies in every generation. So first, as we begin in Hilchot Beit HaBechira, the laws of the chosen house of Maimonides, the first chapter, Halacha Aleph, the first halacha, Maimonides tells us, Mitzvat aseh la'asot bayit Lashem. It is a positive commandment to erect a house for God. Muchan lihiyot bo makrivim bo hakorbanot. Ready to bring there the offerings, ready to make the offerings there. V'chogegin elav shalosh pa'amim b'shana, and we all celebrate there, we make the pilgrimage there 3 times a year. Shene'amar, as it says in the Torah, as the verse states, in the book of Exodus, chapter 25, verse 8, Ve'asuli mikdash v'shichanti b'tocham. And God instructs the people of Israel, they shall make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell amongst them. And the important thing about this verse, as Maimonides is really interpreting it, is that he is instructing us that from this verse we are told, we are instructed, that we have a commandment in every generation to build the temple, or as now we're going to refer to it as rebuilding it. So we have this verse, V'asuli mikdash v'shichanti b'tocham, and they shall make for me a sanctuary, mikdash, the temple. Uchvar nitparesh b'Torah mishkan sha'asa Moshe Rabbeinu. And Maimonides continues and tells us the tabernacle, which was built by Moses, is already explained in the Torah. V'haya lefi sha'ah. But it was only temporary. It was only for a very specific period of time, Shene'amar, because there is a verse in the book of Deuteronomy, it's in chapter 12, verse 9, that tells us, Ki lo va'atem ad ata, this verse which instructs us that the concept of the tabernacle was only until the people of Israel had come to their permanent inheritance, which is what this verse refers to. So it's important for us to realize, as we've discussed that in our introduction to this particular series, that Maimonides, who is, of course, especially in the area of the temple, considered to be the great codifier, he is really solidifying for us and unifying for us various streams of tradition and presenting everything in a very straightforward manner. And the first thing that he has to tell us is that it is considered to be one of the positive commandments to build the temple. That means that building the temple is something that God commanded to the people of Israel, that is included in that entire structure of all of the commandments which make up our covenant with God. And thus, just as the people of Israel are commanded, for example, to fulfill many other statutes and laws and edicts that God instructs us, which are more familiar to people and more readily acceptable by all streams of Jewry, that these are definitely commandments. It's definitely a mitzvah to keep Shabbat, right? Everyone knows that the Jewish people are obligated to keep Shabbos, to follow the Sabbath. It's universally accepted that it is a positive commandment for us to keep the kosher dietary laws. And every Jew knows that it is a commandment to put tefillin on every day, phylacteries. Maimonides is telling us that it's also a commandment to build the temple. And this is a very, very important point, because there are many who are under the impression that somehow there is a different type of situation regarding the commandment of the temple, and that perhaps is not for all time, perhaps it was only given for a certain time, perhaps it's only under certain circumstances, and we have to explore all of these questions and see if that really is so or not. But so far, we're being instructed here, and again, the whole beauty, the whole point of this particular aspect of our study together of Maimonides is that, the Torah tells us how to live as Jews. The Torah tells us what our obligations are in our relationship with God. And here we are going to be exploring the very vivid and structured details of how these commandments are to be fulfilled. So first of all, he tells us that it is a positive commandment to build that sanctuary, known as the Mikdash, the temple, ready to be bringing the sacrificial offerings to, and that already is an answer to many people who, whenever we're talking about the temple, they ask, well, are you really planning on going back to sacrifices? Is that really something that the Torah expects us to be doing? Will we be bringing the sacrifices again? And here we are told that this is the reason for building the temple, that we will be bringing the offerings there, because the Torah instructs us, and they shall make for me a sanctuary. And one of the important things for us to point out is that Maimonides here is really explaining this commandment as being a very comprehensive commandment. One commandment which actually, according to his opinion, includes many, many details. And this is a very, very important idea to understand, because if you look at the verses in the Torah, in the various Torah readings, for example, in the book of Exodus, in those chapters that describe the aspects of the tabernacle, which of course later became the temple, it's really one and the same concept, it's interchangeable. Well, there are so many things that God instructs us there to create. He tells us exactly how to build the tabernacle, but he also instructs us as to the exact details of many of the vessels, the menorah, the incense and the incense altar, the priestly garments. All of these things are amplified or explained much more in the oral tradition, and this is an important connection, how the details of the commandments, which don't seem to be explained in the scriptural verses, are actually amplified. They're actually explained in the oral tradition, because of course we believe that when Moses received the Torah on Mount Sinai, he received it in two parts. It's the same author, it has the same degree of authority and holiness. This is something that we cannot emphasize enough, that for the Jewish people, the oral tradition has the same legally binding sanctity as the Torah itself, as the Tanakh, because Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights, and then at that time God explained to him the myriad complexities and nuances of every single mitzvah, of every commandment, and how all of the details of the commandments are to be fulfilled. And this, of course, is such an important concept, because there are many commandments which appear in the Torah that don't seem to be self-explanatory at all. And there are so many examples of this concept, the connection, the relationship between the oral tradition and the written Torah. And just to name a few examples, things that we have spoken about together in the past, the concept of Shabbat, which is the very cornerstone of Jewish observance. Well, it's so important to observe Shabbat that one who observes Shabbat publicly, makes every effort to observe Shabbat, is considered to be a Jew who is classified as one who tries to keep the entire Torah. But yet there's very little written about Shabbat in the Torah itself. In the Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, there's very little about Shabbat observance, and yet Shabbat is so important and so complex. How do we know exactly how we are expected by God to observe Shabbat? Because this was explained to Moses on Mount Sinai. Moses, in addition to receiving the details of how the commandments are to be fulfilled, he also received a very important set of principles of how the Torah is to be expounded and how the Torah is to be understood in every changing generation. Because if we believe, of course, that the Torah is the blueprint of creation, then it is immutable, and we must understand how every clime and every different generation can find itself in the Torah itself. Other examples of the same concept would be, I like to use this example, the scribal arts. There's very, very little written in the Torah itself about how to write a mezuzah, or how to write the tefillin, the phylacteries that we wear in prayer, or a Sefer Torah itself, the Torah scroll. The laws pertaining to exactly how these items have to be written on parchment, with what type of ink, and how every letter is to appear, these are amongst the most complex concepts in the entire scope of Judaism. And yet all it says about these things, it says, for example, in Deuteronomy 6, that you shall place them for a sign upon your hands and for frontlets between your eyes, and you shall put them on your doorposts, the doorposts of your gates. But how do we know exactly how these things look, to the extent that when the archaeological excavation of Masada uncovered mezuzot and tefillin, they found that there had been actually no change, that we are writing these things, we are keeping them in the same manner for 3,500 years. So there is a tradition that is being handed down that was actually revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. It was given over from Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, to the prophets. So in every subsequent generation there is a chain of tradition. So this is an important concept for us to understand in the relationship of the temple as well. Because in the book of Exodus, we find many commandments that are related to us regarding the exact nature of the temple, the appearance of the vessels that are to be used in the temple, the sacred vessels for the service, the priestly garments. But there, in the verses, we're not given all that much detail. And of course, there are so many different interpretations that you probably have seen of how these things are to appear. So many different depictions of how the garments appear, for example. There are so many different ways of understanding it. And the truth is that the relationship between the oral tradition and the Torah here is very, very important to understand, because the details pertaining to all of these commandments are given to us in the form of the oral tradition. And this is a whole subject in itself that we have spoken about upon occasion, and which we really need to dedicate some time to understand why the highest wisdom of the Creator decreed that the proper manner for Him to bestow the Torah upon Israel and for Him to bequeath this knowledge to us is in two parts: the written and the oral, which is really a flowing, living Torah. And in fact, the oral tradition, even though today basically the entire body of literature known as the oral tradition is available in writing, it's still referred to as the oral tradition because its very nature is that it's intended to be related orally, to be transmitted in every generation from teacher to student. It was only at a very particular time in history when the Roman oppressors in the land of Israel were systematically persecuting and actually executing all of those Torah sages who possessed this knowledge in an effort to snuff out the Torah from Israel. A decision was made that even though it is the oral Torah, and this is what God had intended, decision was made for it to be committed to writing in order for it to be preserved, but it's still known even today as the oral Torah. So getting back to what I wanted to explain, when we have all of these commandments in these parshiot, for example, in these Torah readings in the book of Exodus, you'll find that there are literally tens and tens and tens of action-oriented expressions. Here are some of them for you to look at and think about. Some of these expressions, and they shall make, and you shall make for me, in the plural and the singular. All of these verses that you see here are examples of action-oriented expressions where God is telling us to create these items for the temple. And yet, interestingly, according to the opinion of Maimonides, which he records here, all of these individual expressions are not specific mitzvot. They're not individual commandments. In other words, Maimonides is teaching us here that really there is one commandment to build the temple. And that commandment contains and is made up of many, many individual aspects. And in fact, this is exactly what he explains in another work called Sefer HaMitzvot, the Book of Mitzvot. There, in the section dealing with the positive commandments, it's actually in number 20, in the Book of Commandments, Maimonides explains that the mitzvah, the commandment of building the temple, is one commandment which includes many, many different parts. And he gives, for example, the menorah, the table of the showbread, the altar. All of these things, he explains, are individual aspects of one commandment. And the reason that this particular idea is really very important, and in fact even exciting, regarding the work of the Temple Institute, is because if there's really only one commandment to build the temple, and that commandment is made up of many different facets and sub-commandments, that means that it's all called the temple. In other words, the menorah is the temple, the table is the temple, the garments are the temple. This is exactly Maimonides' opinions, that all of those verses that appear, for example, in Exodus, that are action-oriented, because the Torah is action-oriented, they're not individual commandments. In other words, there's a count of commandments in the Torah, 613 commandments, but you'll only find one, which is the commandment to build the temple, and that's this one, in Exodus 25, verse 8, and they shall make for me a sanctuary. And all of these other verses that we're giving over to you here to ponder, some examples, those verses are not individual commandments, they're aspects of the one big commandment. And why do I consider that to be actually exciting? Because that means that since there's only one commandment to build the temple, if there is some sort of temporary obstacle in building the temple itself in its proper place, and of course it can only be built in that one area, and we are going to be learning in great detail here in the work of Maimonides why that place is so important, why the temple can only be built on Mount Moriah, on the Temple Mount, and why God himself chose that place and designated it and sanctified it, that that's the only place for the building of the temple. But if there is a temporary obstacle in the building of the temple, since all of these items are also called the Mikdash, and they're also part of that mitzvah, part of that basic commandment, by building those things and by preparing as best as possible, we are already fulfilling the commandments of Exodus 25, verse 8, and they shall make for me a sanctuary. We are building that one step at a time, as best as possible, according to the conditions that we have here today, the human condition, or if you'll call it, the political situation. As far as the religious principle is concerned, of our obligation in Hashem's eyes to build the temple, we can fulfill this in the meantime as best as possible by actually creating the vessels. And this is one of the underlying principles of the work of the Temple Institute, that by creating the vessels today, even though we have what I like to refer to as a temporary obstacle in the building of the temple in its appointed place, we are already beginning the process of rebuilding as best as possible. And the process of preparation has begun through the building of the vessels. So, again, Maimonides explains this is the place that God has designated in order to bring there the offerings, the place that we shall be celebrating at and assembling at 3 times a year, minimally, on the pilgrimage festivals. And Maimonides also explains that the tabernacle, which was explained in great detail in the Torah, the tabernacle that was erected by Moses was something temporary. It was something that was only for a very, very specific period of time, based again on this verse that you see here, Deuteronomy 12. This verse teaches us that the tabernacle was only to facilitate the sojourning of the children of Israel until such time when they were able to erect the permanent structure on its location in Mount Moriah in Jerusalem. There are several ideas here that we need to expound upon. One is the idea that, in general, at this point in our understanding, the tabernacle and the temple are really the same concept. They are interchangeable. In other words, when God first gave the commandment to the people of Israel, and you shall make for me a sanctuary, the word which is used, if you notice, look at the word here in Hebrew, the word that was used in Exodus 25 is mikdash, and that is the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. However, this commandment was originally fulfilled with the Mishkan. You see, this is the tabernacle, which is the temporary, collapsible, movable version of the temple, which was adapted to those traveling conditions in the desert and for those number of years in the land of Israel as well, until David and Samuel established the concept of Mount Moriah, what God had in mind, and we're going to talk more about that. But conceptually, the tabernacle is really the same as the temple. In other words, the temple consisted of the same format of the outer courtyard, the holy area, the Holy of Holies, as you can see by this comparison. But the concept is that conceptually the temple grew larger, but it was the same thing proportionally, in other words, as the tabernacle itself. These are the first concepts that we encounter in our study, and Maimonides clarifies these things for us, and really what he is trying to do is he's trying to assemble into one place and to give us in one fixed order a certain progression of the development of this concept in the framework of Jewish law, as well as the history of how this was fulfilled, and how it, and as we will see, how it can be fulfilled and will be fulfilled again. So the important thing first for us to understand here, again, which really, it's a huge concept. So we mustn't go too fast. We have to understand what we've said here. We've said that Maimonides is telling us it is a commandment to build the temple. It is not a theological conundrum. It is not some sort of idea, that we have to wait for some sort of divine intervention to bring about. It is classified, as are the other commandments, as an action-oriented directive which is incumbent upon the people of Israel to fulfill. And we're going to see as we continue under which conditions and exactly how and who is to build the temple, because many people are going to be asking, in fact, this question might be crossing your mind right now. I thought that the Messiah is supposed to build the temple, or I thought that the temple is supposed to descend from heaven. How do we understand these things in the context of what Maimonides is saying, which seems to be very straightforward instruction to build the temple? We need to analyze this. Is there a relationship, for example, between the coming of the Messiah and the building of the temple? This is something that we need to discuss. Another question which comes up all the time is, well, can we rebuild the tabernacle temporarily? The tabernacle, after all, was a temporary structure, and if we have a problem right now in the rebuilding of the temple, why can't we fulfill God's will by, in the meantime, building the tabernacle somewhere else? And some people think that that is a very good question. And it is a very good question. We need to understand why that cannot be the case. We actually know where the original components of the tabernacle are, but we are not to build the tabernacle. The tabernacle was only for that specific period of history, but now this commandment can only be fulfilled by the erection of the Holy Temple on Mount Moriah. And of course, exactly when that's going to come about and under what circumstances and how is another situation that we have to discuss. And it's not something which is in heaven. It's not something which is mystical. We need to talk about how that can happen, because that is the will of God, that is the fulfillment of every prophecy, and that is the direction of the Jewish people. The whole concept of rebuilding the temple, why it's important to us, why we want to see the temple rebuilt is not for any other reason other than the fact that it is a commandment of God, that it is the seat of the restoration of His honor. Our sages tell us that the Holy Temple is the light of the whole world, and that is, of course, a reference to the light of the Shekhinah, the divine presence that rests amongst humanity through the Holy Temple, and that, of course, is both the light to Israel and the light to the nations.